Para simbolizar a contribuição da cultura africana na literatura, não haveria melhor nome do que o nosso convidado de hoje, Wole Soyinka. Suas peças teatrais, romances e poemas lhe valeram, em 1986, o Prêmio Nobel de Literatura. Welcome to the city of Porto Alegre, Professor Soyinka. Axé. It is a great honor to have you here as a guest of our book chamber and the Bienal Foundation. Jean-Paul Sartre visited Brazil in the 1960s. And after having addressed several audiences in different cities and academic centers in Brazil, Elisa, he asked, "Where are the Afro-Brazilians? I don't see them." That's what Sartre asked in the 60s. Professor Soyinka, is Afro-Brazilian culture visible to your eyes in the city of Porto Alegre? So I will pass the responsibility to continue this to Elisa.
In the 1970s, my husband Abdias Nascimento and I were in Africa, in Dakar, for a meeting called the Encounter for World Alternatives, which was also the founding meeting of the Union of African Writers, which Wole Soyinka was at that time at the helm of. And in the company of Sheikh Anta Diop and Carlos Moore and others, we were able to witness his commitment to the idea of Ogun Abibiman. Ogun Abibiman is a title of one of his most famous poems. And the word Abibiman comes from the Kiswahili and is one example of the identity of African Black peoples above and beyond ethnic specificities. And there are several words in African languages that denote that identity. And I think the commitment that he has shown to the Black people of the diaspora is something that flows from his Ogunic force. It comes from the soil of Africa itself and meets so many of his relatives here in Brazil. So perhaps that is one of the reasons that Brazil, as Cuba and other countries of the Americas, have been focus of his attention. And I also want Gilberto to observe how important it is for the biennial in Porto Alegre, the MERCOSUL biennial, to adopt the theme of the triangle, the Atlantic Triangle, with this emphasis on the importance of the African origin of culture in the Americas and in Brazil specifically. The other countries of MERCOSUL as well, Argentina, Uruguay, even Chile as well, because this is an area that has not been explored, particularly when we think about contemporary art. And the importance of that new approach that you have mentioned to me, which is the idea of bringing the makers of that culture themselves as protagonists of the biennial, as protagonists of the way the art is to be shown and produced, is also a very new innovation in Brazil. My husband Abdias denounced the way that in Brazil, often African Brazilian culture is spoken of or represented by those who consider themselves the authorities and who are not the makers of that culture. So I think that is a very important novelty, which the presence of our guest represents in a hugely dignified way. Own literary work has shown that rather than needing to reinterpret Greek myths through an African lens, we have the African myths and cultures as the base of an autonomous creative tradition that has its own foundations and actually are earlier than those which we normally think of as the first, for example, dramatic traditions. We have the habit of locating those origins always in Greece. But as Abdias Nascimento said in his prologue to a book, an anthology of Black theater called Dramas for Blacks and Prologue for Whites, which was published back in 1961, they were already showing that those early origins of drama, literature, philosophy were earlier and in Africa, and the work of protagonists that were Black Africans. So that is a very important part of what he represents. And in 1977, in the context of the Second World Festival of Black and African Arts and Culture held in Lagos, Nigeria, it happened that Abdias was a colleague of Professor Soyinka at the University of Ife, and the Brazilian government had already confiscated his passport and did everything it could to make sure that he was unable to speak at the colloquium, which was the political and intellectual forum of the festival. And his thesis that he would present was printed by the University of Ife, and we put it under in our little Brazilian Volkswagen and drove to Lagos and registered as observers and distributed that among the African and diaspora delegations who were there. And the veto that was made by the government of Brazil, together with the governments that were running the festival, was essentially opposed and broken by the force of Ogun, of Wole Soyinka, and many other intellectuals and activists who were there at the time. And that book was published the next year here in Brazil under the title, The Genocide of Blacks in Brazil. This book had a preface written by Professor Soyinka, which told that story, and has just been republished here in Brazil, O Genocídio do Negro Brasileiro. And it's not a commemorative edition. This edition is a continuation of the same struggle, because we have in Brazil at this moment not a metaphor, but a true situation of genocide. The reason that the word genocide is used by those who oppose the enormous proportion of Black deaths among the murders of which Brazil is now the champion in the world, going much farther in a 3-year period. 192,000 homicides were committed in Brazil, a number larger than all the 12 wars that were happening in the world at that time, including Iraq, Afghanistan, Colombia, and many others, Israel and Palestine, all put together in one 3-year period. This situation has not changed, and the victims of that violence are black. And the reason for that is still racial discrimination. We just had here the launching of the Oxfam report on inequality in Brazil, which showed the same situation. And we also witness, Professor, today, even in a country where the African religious matrix is evident and is seen often as a tourist attraction, but we have witnessed a wave of violence against the African Brazilian religious communities that has been very intense. And so we know that as we republish this book, you are with us again in confronting those situations. And Ogun is with us again, as the documentary that we saw yesterday. I had the pleasure of seeing the documentary by Eliane Marques and Tiago Piragira and Adriano Migliavaca, and the readings of your work, which inspire us to go on with this struggle. And I didn't want to, I know I'm sure I'm speaking too much, but I did want to give a small witness to Professor Soyinka's effort to celebrate Afro-Brazilian heritage in Lagos in 2013 at the Lagos Black Heritage Festival, which was a celebration of the Afro-Brazilian traditions that survive in the Lagos community of those who returned from Brazil to Africa, and unfortunately did not have enjoy the support of the Brazilian government, but did have the opportunity to have an exhibition of Abdias Nascimento's paintings by sending the digital files and reproducing them, and also performance of his play. And at that festival, perhaps the most telling initiative is the exhibition of artwork by children organized in the schools of Lagos, children from 6 years old to 14 years old, called Vision of the Child. And that year, the theme of the exhibition was 1001 Faces of Corruption. So the children did these artworks on their different interpretations of the blight of corruption, which the fight against that, I think, is something that we in Brazil share with Wole Soyinka in his Ogunic strides toward a new and better future. And so thank you very much for being with us.
Yes, it's quite true that when I'm in Brazil, I do not feel I'm a stranger, and I've been coming here many, many years. Brazil, Cuba, Colombia, even Puerto Rico, Colombia, when I was there, yes, wherever there is African retention, for me, that is second home. A very quick anecdote, and then I will read just, I'm not going to give a formal lecture. I think this atmosphere is, less informal. Oh, that's informal. But let me give an episode to show you that this is, for me, it's not an academic issue. It's a visceral issue. I've never accepted the fact that Africa, given our history, ends on its saline borders, that Africa is completely bounded and is hermeticized by either the Atlantic or whatever other ocean. But history has pushed that continent outwards into infinite regions. I was in Jamaica once. I was at the time in exile, and I narrate this actually in my memoirs. I was pursued at the time by a very relentless, late now, dictator called Sani Abacha. And we were struggling to get rid of him. And finally, I was thrown into exile at the urging not only of my own sense of vastly diminishing security, but virtually pushed out by my colleagues and sent out to start at least clandestine radio so that the world could know what was happening. When I was in Jamaica, I was teaching at the University of West Indies. And I had been placed on trial, and I'd been sentenced in absentia. And my mortal fear was that if anything happened to me, some well-meaning friends and family, and I had been placed on trial, and I'd been sentenced in absentia. And my mortal fear was that if anything happened to me, some well-meaning friends and family might decide to take my body home. And I certainly did not want my body to occupy the same space as the dictator I despise dictators normally, but this one I despised with a passion. He'd already killed he's hanged, in fact, a young colleague of mine, Ken Saro-Wiwa, who was the leader of the Ogoni people in their struggle for recognition. And on trumped-up charges, Ken Saro-Wiwa and 8 other Ogoni chiefs were actually hanged by this man. And so I was totally committed to, if possible, getting my hands on him and hanging him. But it looked more likely that he would get his hands on me outside. So I told my colleague, my family, I said, don't take my body home. I said, I'm going to find a piece of land. And if anything happens to me in the Caribbean or anywhere there was African diaspora, and make sure I'm buried there. Don't take me home. And I began looking for a piece of land. It was an obsession for me. I just did not want to go home when that dictator was running that nation. And during my search, I ran into the county of Westmoreland in Jamaica. I'd been told, I'd learned that there was some kind of Yoruba settlement there. I'd stored that information away in a kind of academic way, but not really done much about it. Kept postponing, I must visit one of these days, And when things got to that extent, I said, it's about time I visited, see what it's like. The place was called Bekuta. Now, I come from Abeokuta. And there was a similarity that the connection had been made even long before me. So I finally visited there, and sure enough, met the old lady who was the one surviving member of the family which fled their slave masters, fled up the mountain, and they looked for a place to settle which reminded them of home. Abeokuta. Abeokuta means under the rocks. And so they found this settlement in Westmoreland County, restored their traditions, cuisine, dances, music, rituals, so that when I visited the first time, I saw a microcosm of my own Abeokuta town. And I said, yes, anything happens to me, make sure my body is buried there. So it's not a technical, it's not as I said, it's not an academic, it's not just a historic issue. I've rejected completely any notion that the African continent is bounded by that accident of land mass movements which isolated the continent, broke it off from the continental shelf or whatever. No, for me, Africa exists outside its own borders. At the same time, however, we know that culture is not static. Anybody who thinks that the transference of culture across any distance is going to be found in the same form is absolutely deceiving himself or herself. Even within the origins of cultures, culture moves. It's dynamic. But there are certain core elements which makes it possible for one to identify oneself with other people in any community, on home ground or outside. And this, for me, is what distinguishes what you might call regional cultures, the genuine, authentic culture of a people. The Orisha is one such example of transference, which has not, however, landed either in Colombia or in Brazil or in Cuba in exactly the same form. I'll give you an example. Take Eshu. If you go to Brasilia, you'll find a park of the African deities. Central to this pantheon where all the deities are represented, central to it is Eshu. In the Brazilian park of the deities, Eshu is considered the prime deity, the principal deity. In its home of origin, this is not so. Eshu is an important member of the pantheon of the deities, but Eshu in African society is, in Yoruba society especially, where he belongs, he's the messenger of the gods, but at the same time, he is the gatekeeper to the principle of divination, which is the province of Orunmila. And if you look at an Ifa bowl, the divination tray, you'll see a figure carved there. In Nigeria, in Yoruba land, that figure, that face at the head of the Ifa tray is known as Oju Ifa, the eye of Ifa. Here, however, I find that in the diaspora, many people believe that that figure is Eshu. Now, there's a historical reason for that kind of transformation, and it's one which speaks to the combativeness of the Yoruba when they found themselves in the diaspora. When the the Christian evangelists arrived in Yoruba land, they needed something crucial to be able to propagate their religion. They needed evil. They had to have evil to ensure that their would-be convertites were made to feel that they were living in perpetual sin. And so they needed a representative of Satan, of the devil. So they looked around the pantheon and said, now, which of these deities can we co-opt and transform in a negative way and impress on the people that this is their enemy, this is their obstacle to paradise, to eternal bliss. So they picked on poor Eshu. Now, it's in compensation for that the Yoruba who came here, in defiance of that demonization of this deity, that Eshu got catapulted to the position of principal deity. In other words, they were saying, shall we say to the Roman Catholic pastors, oh, I see, you picked on Eshu, you demonized him, turned him evil, well, we're now going to make him the principal deity. It's one of those historic transpositions, which, however, in no way nullifies or reduces the authenticity of the Orisha worship. If you go to Cuba and you see the representation of the deities, the style of the sculptures is anything but Yoruba style of sculpting. It's very realistic in Cuba, same as in Brasilia. Quite unlike the eerie, the floating deities of El Salvador on the artificial lake. I had to phone to remind me where I first saw these sculptures, and then she informed me even the name of the sculptor, Morena. So the point of this is that every generation, every society interprets and reinterprets the deities in their own way, in their own image, in relation to their own histories. And one of the sad passages of African history is that very often they had to come back to the recovery of their own culture, their own identity, through European eyes. All that is coming towards an end. African society is reclaiming its own history, and I believe that the co-option of African images and African presence in events like the Bienal here and the book fair go a long way towards that restoration which is long overdue. It's almost like the communication system, I think. The Nigerian nation is next door to Benin, Republic of Benin. But about 30 years ago, to speak to somebody in Benin, you had to go through the exchange box in the United Kingdom, and then goes to Paris, and then Paris to Benin, just next door. And it's the same principle that has applied to African cultures, not just Yoruba culture, that the interpretation which is being adopted, I mean, the conversion, the complete distortion of many symbols of African society, of many habits, of many rituals, the demonization of some of the most sacred principles of African society, that process has been reacquired in many instances by African society themselves, so that when you go to some universities, you find yourself having to argue with people saying, no, 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 no. You see, this happens to be my religion. This happens to be my society. This is my culture. Let me tell you what the Babalawo, who lives next door to me, how he interprets this or that. But no, tomes have been written. They've gone into the canonical structure of teaching, of understanding African societies. And the reclamation process is what is going on among young Africans, new generation Africans today. Elise spoke about the Festac 77, the Black African Festival of Black and African Cultures. The symposium she talked about was a tug of war. There we found that the obstacles, the opposition, was not even so much this time the European world of intellection, of cultural, of art history, of cultural assessment. No, it was even our very neighbors, the Arab world. They wanted very much, not just to be a part of that festival, but to be part of the integral identity of the African continent. And we said, wait a minute, yes, we are neighbors. We're neighbors, but that doesn't mean that there is no Black African culture. Oh, and then you had the ideologues, the Marxists, the class-conscious protagonists of egalitarian utopia. So this is backward thinking. This is backward thinking. No, you've got to think of Africa, you've got to think of Pan-Africanism in terms of anybody who's ever been a victim. It even became that reductionist. That if you've ever been a victim of colonial or imperialist domination, you thereby became an instant community. We found that appalling. The Arabs have their own culture. It's a very valid one. Lots of the history of Arab culture is one to which, in fact, the European world owes a lot. But it is not the authentic African history. And so this became a real battle. And while you have, on the one hand, somebody like Abdias do Nascimento, efforts being made to exclude him, you had the Arab world bringing their own culture once again, and I say once again very deliberately, once again to dominate and become new imperators of the African continent. I said once again simply because the slave trade was not only in one direction. The trans-Saharan slave trade preceded the transatlantic towards Europe and the Caribbean, and even outlasted it. And we're saying, yes, we may share certain things, but we also are differentiated by certain things, by memory, in addition to even the actual cultural realities, by economic strategies, economic relationships, by history and so on. We say, just give us some time, give us equal time to reconstruct the African identity and reconstruct it in the direction in which history has already taken it without any artificiality. And it's that mission, in fact, I don't like to use the word mission because it sounds like something outside oneself. Let me just say it's that process of recovery that dominates some of the cultural strategies which we have adopted. She mentioned one of them, the Lagos Black Heritage Festival, one of whose features, the most fascinating for me and the most rewarding, was its addition of what we called the black in the Mediterranean blue. And the whole idea was this, that we'll take the Mediterranean, which belongs to everybody. This is the concourse of the greatest world civilizations, from which the African continent, however, has been consistently excluded or else diminished. Whereas we know historically the extant works, the iconography of that region points very clearly to the contribution which the African culture has made to the whole world. So we said, all right, let's take this pond called the Mediterranean. I will take all the various European nations around that lake, and we'll take them one by one, and we'll see what effect their incursion into Africa has had on Africans, and in addition to see what effect African presence around the Mediterranean, what contribution it has made to the cultures of Europe. And we began with Italy, Eritrea, Ethiopia, etc., and even parts of West Africa. That was the first. Brazil, in fact, was to have been the first. But Brazil can sometimes be a very difficult country, and especially in terms of its own history and its presence, its reluctance to acknowledge African presence. And so we had a very hard time with Brazil. So very quickly, since there was so much foot dragging, we began with Italy. But by that time, we'd made up our minds, we've given ourselves more time. We made up our minds that Brazil was next, willy-nilly. I visited here. Elise knows all about it. The Africa House here assisted. Even the Nigerian embassy was part of it. One of your presidents came to Nigeria, and together with our president, Jonathan, actually announced the oncoming festival involving both Brazil and Nigeria. We came here, we were promised a contingent of, I think it began with about 150, more than close to 200. And gradually, the contingent diminished to about 75, then 50, then 25, and then finally, we were offered 4 or 5, I can't remember. And they were supposed to be, in fact, they were supposed to come and hold a cinema workshop in Nigeria. It was very depressing. Even recently, there was an opera supposed to come from Brazil, a new opera based on the history of some slaves between Africa and Brazil. And we look forward so much to having that opera open in Nigeria. It did not, something happened. I met officers, officials, state officials, federal officials, and to cut a long story short, there was no contingent, but fortunately, we had Abdias. And we performed the plays of Abdias, we put up an exhibition of Abdias, and we were able, again, luckily, to trap this dance troupe, the Zai, what's the name now, I've forgotten, and they were able to have a carnival vibe, yes, to do that. So we did manage to show a Brazilian presence, but it was very disappointing. And the Orisha took a hand, and it was that year that Brasilia lost badly in World Cup to a little-known country, I don't know. That was the judgment of the gods. And I made sure that but we're nothing if not persistent. We're nothing if not persistent. And I tell you what the new scheme is. The reverse journey, we believe, has to take place. Yes, the slave experience was traumatizing. The memory is still raw in many areas. But culturally, there has been some compensation. The very knowledge, the very symbiosis that has taken place between African nations, and especially the Yoruba world and the Caribbean, and particularly Brazil. And an ongoing scheme right now is what we call the Grand Voyage Home, in which we are collaborating with Palermo, the Isle of Palermo in Italy, in Sicily, with the mayor who's very enthusiastic. And we're trying to get a boat. This should have taken place last year. Once again, there were problems, but we haven't given up. And the whole idea is that the boat will take off from Palermo, and that those who want to participate will fly from Brazil, from Cuba, from Colombia, wherever, to Palermo, and the boat will take off towards North Africa and hug the West African, the North African and West African coast, stopping at those towns like Essaouira, like Dakar, Ghana, Algiers, of course, which have played a very strong role in the history of the trans-Saharan and transatlantic slave trade. And on the boat will be exhibitions, performances, will be lectures, seminars, will be a constant. It's like going to be a moving feast of the annual African festival. Only this time, it'll terminate in Lagos itself. And there'll be the worshippers from the Orisha worshippers from Brazil, just what we've always planned and what we think is coming close to fruition. One of the greatest dreams we have is to have a parade on one side of the Orisha worshippers from Brazil, and on the other side, the traditional Orisha priests and shrine leaders, and to have an ecumenical meeting, a dialogue between what the culture of the Orisha has become here, the way it's been transformed, and what it is in origin. It's one event. It's going to be a unique event, not just for the worshippers themselves, but for scholars, the quote-unquote experts who insist on pronouncing on the autochthonous cultures and religious habits and facts of that society. So it's on once again, but this time we're not depending on you Brazilians. You've let us down too badly before, but we're just letting you know.
Not the Bienal. Not the Bienal.
No, you're making some compensation towards, you're making some redress.
Thank you.
Some redress. And I think we're even going to shift focus to Porto Alegre in terms of organizing from here. I want to make sure that I place the Orisha worship in its proper context, because one doesn't want to err on the other side and return the Orisha worship into a kind of ghetto categorization. Sometimes I use the expression invisible religions. When I use that expression, I'm talking about invisibility from the other side. In other words, everything is invisible to a blind person. And if the world does not know about the Orisha, it's not really that the Orisha are invisible, but that the other side insists on being purblind towards the lessons of the Orisha. The meaning of Orisha is ecumenism. If you want to look for a word, a theological word for Orisha, it's ecumenism, tolerance, a recognition in all aspects and as represented in all the deities that truth is a permanent quest. Truth is not doctrinaire. That humanity is in constant search for truth, and that Orisha is the gateway to truth. So Orisha cannot be oppressive. Orisha has never, in its history anywhere, fought a crusade on its own behalf, launched a jihad. Orisha does not even believe in proselytizing. Orisha believes that every individual finds his or her own Godhead. And that is why in a traditional compound, you will have side by side Ogun, Shango, Oshosi, Yemoja, Oshun, within the same family. And there's total harmony. And when the gods have their rituals, let us say it is Ogun season, it's quite normal to see, for instance, the worshippers of Shango also trooping out to celebrate, because the Yoruba understand that these deities are symbolic gateways to the ultimate attainment of truth, which is the permanent search of humanity. Let me end with one story, because I want to place Orisha in a universal context, what it actually means to us sometimes, and its relationship to other deities. It's a personal story, but I want you to accept that I'm speaking as a kind of surrogate of the Orisha in this respect, in terms of trying to represent the Orisha sensibility. I hallucinated once. It took place in at the Heathrow Airport Hotel, the Sofitel. I had an overnight, owing to a cancellation, I was forced to stay at the airport hotel that day, and I got to work. Since I had the whole day, I got to work. And I thought I would work for about an hour, 2 hours, and then go into London, look at the sights and come back. But as sometimes happens, by dusk, I was still working. I'd lost count of the time completely. And so I came out to the corridor. As I turned the corner, I was confronted by a sight which convinced me that I was hallucinating. Because I had passed through that passage several hours before I got to work, and suddenly there were goddesses everywhere, floating around and walking on padded feet. It was like as if the rainbow had fragmented, and shards of the rainbow were just occupying all the space, the corridors. So I ducked back into my room. I said, what was this I just saw? Then I thought, oh, could it be I was dead? Are these creatures from the outer world? Actually, it wasn't a bad sensation, feeling you're dead. It was rather nice, because I was feeling and I was seeing things. So my coffee cup was still there, where I'd brewed some espresso, and television set was there. So I said, well, okay. But after a while, I said, let me go and check on this thing I saw just now. If they are goddesses, then I will represent Ogun at this convocation of gods and goddesses. So I came out. When I came out, everything had disappeared. They all vanished. So I walked very slowly to that same area near the lift and the stairs, where I'd seen all these extraterrestrial beings in multicolored. And when I got there was a balcony. I looked over, and there it was. A wedding was in process, an Indian wedding. And seated at one end was the god Ganesha, the elephant. So I stood there, all the travelers, the voyagers, they were all around, the drinkers with paused, watching this scene and the beautiful ceremony of this Indian wedding. It just occupied me for the rest of the day, and I was not alone. It was, instead of the usual three-piece suit, tuxedo weddings which you normally associate with England, that entire place was transformed into a temple from the Asian world. And from that also, that scene, I was transported to my own society, where the habit of Asoebi, as you know, the Asoebi, which is the kind of gaily, beautiful costumes which are worn at weddings, in which the family expresses solidarity by dressing in the same costume, but with variations. It was identical to that. And this is how women show solidarity with one another, in which they are declaring, I'm a member of the family of that bride. I'm a member of the family of that bridegroom, not just extended family, but friends and everything. They take the same costume, and they have the same principle of human solidarity at events which are crucial, which mark the milestones of the family, the community, etc., etc. And then my mind, from that colorful scene, that flotation sensation, my mind then drifted from the Indian world to the land of the Orisha, and then to the land of the Orisha transported here. And my mind went to those floating deities on the lake, the El Salvador. And this, for me, was the expression of that Yoruba world as interpreter, in fact, of the humanistic religions. Sometimes I use the expression the secular religions, because the Orishas are never aloof from humanity. They're not like what I call the unicellular gods, who remote elsewhere, gods who can be converted to evil, as is happening today with movements like Boko Haram, ISIS, and so on, who declare that they are religions of peace, but in actual fact turn the world into a slaughterhouse, all in the name of piety. It is not possible to manipulate the Orisha in that way. On the contrary, the Orisha brings humanity together, expresses a unified Godhead, says to us, in the words of that Muslim sage, Tierno Boka, known as the sage of Bandiagara from Mali, says to us that truth is manifold. There's your truth, there's my truth, and there is the truth. Orisha say, come to the Orisha and be wise. Thank you very much.
Professor Soyinka, during these 2 weeks, we collected questions for you. What do you read when you go to bed?
The truthful answer to that is that by my bedside, I have a stack of books. In the toilet, I have a stack of books. And I read from book to book, so that it can take me a month to actually finish some of those books. In what order I read them, I do not know. It's a question of temperament. And the reason it takes so long is that by the time I've got to bed, I'm already tired. And the next thing I know, the book is falling down and I'm dreaming. But if you ask me, ideally, what of these various books which I have by my bedside, ideally, if I had to pick one and say, this should be my bedtime book, I think it'll be the poetry of Khalil Gibran, which is one of my favorite poets. So, and Khalil Gibran is very much an expression of what we've been talking about, this ecumenical spirit. So if I had to choose a book to send me off to sleep, it would be the poetry of Khalil Gibran. Thank you.
So I would like then to thank you very much for accepting our invitation to come to Porto Alegre. Welcome to come back and put Porto Alegre in that scenario you mentioned, yes. We are very happy to be in this map. And I would like to thank everybody for coming here. And please enjoy the last day of our beautiful book fair. Thank you very much. Thank you.